As we look at an image of Christ on the cross, it's very easy for us to recognize his humanity. In his nakedness, he is made vulnerable and exposed, and we recognize his physical suffering. But it's very important that as we look at this image, as we remember Christ's death, we remember that we are seeing both man and God hanging there. We must never lose sight of the fact that Christ is always fully human and fully divine. There is a famous saying from Dostoevsky when he stood in a Roman Catholic church and looked at a crucifix which emphasized the muscles and the physical presence of Christ. He recognized that it communicated nothing of the divinity of God there on the cross. In fact, he said, a man could lose his faith looking at such an image. We must always recognize that it is both man and God in Christ. And there he is, naked and stripped, something that would have been so shameful, something that was intended to mock him, particularly in a culture in which he was born where people were so reserved and careful about how they dressed. Perhaps it's difficult for us in the West, who are used to people being half-dressed in the cities, to understand what this meant. Because the way we dress may communicate a certain thing. It may communicate a state of mind inclined to sin, or a state of mind that seeks dignity. But there is a paradox. When we look at the life of Christ in the Gospels, in that moment when he calls Lazarus forth from the tomb, he calls him to life, and yet he instructs the disciples to unbind him, to loose him from his burial cloths. We who share Christ's humanity will be resurrected. And yet the paradox is that we must be stripped inwardly to prepare for this, just as the disciples stripped, unbound Lazarus. So too we must allow their example and their teaching, the teachings of Christ, to loosen us, to free us from the bonds, the bindings of this life, the world, sin. All of us, just as Christ is both God and man, all of us live here on earth, creatures, physical creatures, and yet we share in a spiritual nature. God has planted his image within us. And so everything that we do, in every moment of our lives, yes, we get involved in the worldly pursuits that we have responsibility for, our family pressures and so on. We carry responsibilities. But in every moment of these, we may seek a spiritual reality. There is an opportunity to serve God, to be honest, to be fair, to be just in our dealings with other people. Just as we must not lose sight of the divinity of Christ, so too we must not lose sight of our calling to share, not by nature but by grace, in that divinity.